If you thought the Manx language was something from yesteryear, take a listen. There's not only Manx for days of the week, but Manx for daily life. Celebrate the living language of man day in and day out.
It's now time for News in Manx.
Tá sé géisteach leis Radio Mananach was dúlis Ellen Vannan. A há dú náach na seachtain and a lear is dúlis a caracha.
The person who introduced the Manx language to Manx Radio was the great campaigner for the Manx language, Dúlis a Caracha, Doug Fargher, and he got permission from Manx Radio to present a news bulletin in Manx. The first one of those was broadcast on Sunday the 11th of October 1970. You notice that Doug refers to Radio Mananach.
Tá sé géisteach leis Radio Mananach was dúlis Ellen Vannan.
Literally Manx Radio, rather than Radio Vanning, the radio of man, which it later became. I think the change dates from 1977 when Doug came to work at Manx Radio. Originally the bulletins went out at 11 a.m. on a Sunday, but a lady from Peel complained that she couldn't hear it because she was at chapel at that time, so it was moved first to 3 p.m, but then subsequently it was moved to 9 o'clock in the morning. The first bulletins were recorded by Doug Fargher himself, and then a rota was arranged at the monthly committee meetings of an Cheshire, usually with someone undertaking to do all the recordings for the coming month. Well, I didn't feel I could do the news, but they said it was okay to do something generally in Manx. So in the mid-1970s, I started doing bits and pieces. And then my wife, Pi, came along and did some recordings as well. And so we were able to have a conversation rather than a single voice. But later on, I started doing things which I based originally around some sketches I'd heard on the Goon Show. And it turned out one of these was a bit longer than the usual news bulletin, and I apologised to Mike Percival about it when I gave it to him to put in the log. But he said, no, it was fine because the log actually showed 15 minutes for it. So I thought, right, if we've got 15 minutes, we'll fill 15 minutes. So I stretched out some of these things. There were Goon Show type stories and other humorous sketches. And we did documentaries looking at the wreck of the herring fleet in 1787, for example, with bits of music, a two-part play about a witch. And I'd started by recording these programmes at home, mostly on cassette, adding sound effects and doing all the voices. But then, as well as Pi, we were joined by Colin and Crystal Jerry, and on a couple of occasions by David Fisher. Now, as we had sound effects and bits of music in it, we used to come up to Manx Radio on a Saturday morning, and Wally Roughcut McAvoy did the engineering for us. He'd add in all the other bits as we went. I'd give him a copy of the script, and he said he could follow it because he was used to following the Tinble ceremony. Anyway, that was only when it was my turn for the rota for the recordings. And for all the other times, of course, there were people still doing the news bulletins in Manx for that slot. And I think that all came to an end in 1977 when, as I mentioned, Doug Fargher came to work at Manx Radio. And then he started a weekly programme, all in Manx, which was called Clare na Gael, for an hour on a Saturday evening. And that was from September 1977, the start of the winter schedule as they used to have in those days. And he included the news in Clare na Gael. He didn't drive the desk himself, do the engineering, so Roger Watterson was coming in to do that at that time, and the programme was completely in Manx, but there was music in it as well, and Doug used to invite Gil Guerin, Manx speakers, to come up and have a conversation with him, and also, hopefully, to bring some music to play. I went up as Dougie's guest on a couple of occasions, and Dougie said to me that Roger would rather not be there, spending the time driving the desk for him every week, so would I be willing to learn to do that? And then, of course, I'd also be able to contribute to the conversation, which Roger couldn't. Well, Roger showed me what to do, and he came up to watch over my shoulder, and then he left me to it. However, there was one Saturday, and I got up there, and Doug didn't turn up either, so I was stuck with having to ad-lib content in Manx round whatever records I'd brought in that night. And subsequently, Doug said that he wanted to concentrate on his dictionary, so would I take over the programme as a solo effort? Which I did. Now, at that time, as I mentioned, Manx Radio had a winter schedule and a summer schedule. The summer schedule was basically pop music all the way with no specialist shows. And then when the winter schedule for 1978 came in, Claire Nigale was back, but this time it was in a bilingual format, and Doug was joined by Charles Gard. But after a very short time, it transpired they didn't really want to continue with it. Doug, again, was working on his dictionary at the time, and I was asked would I be able to take over the programme in its bilingual format. And so that's been the way of it ever since.
Gilg Jew, Gilg J as Gilg Merach.
Quilliam Shuashal to showed you Claire Nigale. This is Robert getting Carswell or Robert a Carslach.
Have I heard tell of old Bobby Bob?
And I'm here to bring you Claire Nigale, a programme with a thread in the English language as Leis Snaisagil, yes, and with a thread in the Manx Gaelic as well. Chinyan Amera, the mother tongue of Ellen Vanning, the Isle of Man. Although the name of the programme, Claire Nigale, Programme of the Gael, the music has never been restricted to the Gaelic countries, not even just to the Celtic countries, in fact, although obviously that forms a strong basis for it. In the days before a 24-hour service on Manx Radio, there was a recording Doug did of opening up the station in the morning. There's a more recent version of it recorded by Marija Madrill.
Moramai, Sgeliena seb by Appenshelven Glick, as fine a crunya linia at manxradio.com. Finelian wash canen nayadshach.gis Monica Menkert, wash derby a keydes tree.shach Monica Menkert, wash put na hinger as rum there a hochtad nai.queg Monica Menkert, as vi mullock snowel a hochtad nai Monica Menkert, as wash Forsdal, Monica Moods, tree jeg, shade hoch, corrich bon nai key jeg, tree feed as care, shaw Sgeliena da a shunach Vannon, Radio Vannon.
For the close-down sequence, there was a wonderful recording of Louise Quirk and Doug with his beautiful rich voice. Later I was asked to do a copy of Doug's part in Manx, but it wasn't a patch on that wonderful sonority in Doug's voice.
Manx Radio is now closing down.
To Radio Vannon Dunanish.
Manx Radio recommences broadcasting at 6:55 a.m. We hope that you've enjoyed our programs, and we look forward to bringing you information, enjoyment, good music and companionship every day.
The Radio Vannon Goil Toshak the Creedle Vish, the Quegman of the Sharks of Ora. The Treshdown, the Venture Goil Solid and a Clare 9, Tashin Treshdale, the Dermot's Fiss. Soilia Kjolyak Vai as Co-Heshachtas Jewish Gachley.
Manx Radio is the Isle of Man's national commercial radio station, broadcasting from Douglas Head in the beautiful Isle of Man.
To Radio Vannon Station, Radio Shunach Trach the Enelian, as Te Creela was Count Lurish, once Ellen Vannon Ellen.
To those of you who guard and protect us during the night, to the police and firemen, to those in the lighthouse service and the coast guards, to doctors and nurses attending the sick, indeed to all who have to work while others sleep, we wish a quiet and peaceful night.
Jewish to Freilada in a song, as the Ngorda Fudnahi, the Murden She as Arad and Nile, Adson on Shavesh Nadayan Solish, as Arad as Liston Nara, the Naligan as Bondran, the Shaveshach Orus and the Ching, the Jarud of the Holy Fiach, Biden Gobrach, through the Sly Ellen and Gadla, Shingen, Giri, Efech, as Sheol.
To the fishermen at sea, and to all those who earn their living on the great waters around our little island, fair winds and good sailing.
Dan the Eastern, Erekiden, as Dawson, Olju, the Cosnan and Mega, and Furkach and Mura, Magit the Mush, and Ellen Leg Ingen, Tashin Grey, Kervai, as Sholya Mayeru.
From all of us at Manx Radio, the voice of man, a very good night.
Bonan Olju, Ek Radio Vannon, Corre Vannon, Evayeru.
In a conversation with Roger Watterson in 1987, Dula Shikarica spoke not only of the past, but also of his hopes for the future.
The old native speakers gave us a charge. They used to say to us, Freili Bio, which means keep it alive. And that's what we're trying to do.
And was supposed to be and should have been dead about 30 years ago.
but we've managed to save it, and I hope we can pass it on to a future generation.
Hello, this is Doug Fargher. In conjunction with Manx Radio, I'd like to invite you to join us and learn something about our native Gaelic tongue, the language of man.
That was the opening of the Manx course written by Brian Stowell called Aber Shen, and it was presented by Dúla Carricha on Manx Radio. That was in 1986, in Heritage Year. So that's jumping rather ahead from the early days of the 1970s. With Doug and others now appearing on Manx Radio in the early 1970s. In May 1973, Mona Douglas's magazine, Mananach, had 2 anonymous limericks in Manx, I might say. At that time, Doug Fargher was living in Port Erin, and the first limerick says, Ta manani dwi ag pecharn a radio de menig goelarn. Tad ginzach a gilg, as son studieren helg, as imedi kujach tad tarn. There are true Manx people in Port Erin on the radio, often taking part. They're teaching Manx and hunting for students, and many together they're drawing. Tanish pabel de lure ons nanalian, son an asjoen geteruch geschellen. Ta talu shan lair, as goler en air, as eer ons a febernaiach skriwen. There are now people enough in our island for the nation to be as busy as a bee. They're talking the old tongue and going on air, and even in the newspapers writing. So it shows, in fact, that Manx on Manx Radio was part of that swell of interest in the Manx language that started to blossom from the late 60s into the 70s. In the 1970s as well, there was a programme on Manx Radio called Know Your Parish, which was presented by John Quilliam, and he would go around telling stories of the people and the places in each of the parishes of the island. And he would introduce his programme with a few words of Manx. He would say, Morra mai, good morning, or Fasta mai, good afternoon, and he would finish his programme by wishing everybody Le mai, good day from John Quilliam.
Fasta mai. Good afternoon to you all. This is John Quilliam with Know Your Parish. Le mai from John Quilliam.
The programme Morajaduni Sunday morning started with Andy Wint and Brian Stowell in about 2000, and it was paid for by the Gaelic Broadcasting Committee. Subsequently, Simon Clark came in for Andy, and Brian was talking about aspects of Manx history, culture, politics. He also read parts of stories he translated into Manx, and for that he'd read a section in Manx, and then he'd read the same part of the story in English, so all the listeners were able to appreciate the story, whether they were Manx speakers or not.
Let's get on to our Manx short story, Brian. Secret Island of Port Sodric.
Yes, sir, in Manx, Elian Falliach deg Port Sodric. In Manx, the story starts like this. Tad greid vel Elian begon na laia na humma von Chieden, fagus de Port Sodric. Tad greid yes, ons na shanlegen kiet de rau, dreve fin macool on, de rau Port de lai bege an Elian shen, as rened faget fin orenjach. Kinderkris shen, renne obvious ulkachjau an Elian, as chreste von usje de ve tummit gus grunt na mare. And now the English for that piece. They say there's a little island lying submerged under the sea near to Port Sodric. They say also that in the old days, in the time of Finn McCool, that some people were living on that island and that they ridiculed Finn for some reason. Because of that, he cast evil enchantment on the island and pressed it to the bottom of the sea to be submerged. Was that the curse of Finn McCool, or had you taken too long explaining about the secret island?
Not sure. Good am I, Brian? Him shoe?
As a spin-off from Morajaduni, Brian Stowell did some bilingual trails, where he went along a route giving the Manx names on buildings and places, and then he retraced his steps giving the information in English as well. And then when Brian became unable to continue with the programme, Phil Gaughan took over, and then shortly afterwards the programme switched to the afternoon, and its name changed to Golas Gargan. which is a well-known Manx phrase meaning going and grumbling. And of course, lately, Phil has been flying solo, as it were, on Gullas Gagan.
Gullas Gagan.
Right, let's have a look at the Anglo-Manx dictionary. And here's a few little words. Dogan, a firebrand, the name of a children's game. In this game, each player has a stick, the point of which has been reddened in the fire. Each combatant whirls his stick about to keep it burning, while at the same time he endeavours to knock the burning head off the stick of his opponent. The same name is also applied to an obsolete game in which a rude representation of the human figure was fastened on a cross and sticks thrown at it, just after the fashion of a modern Aunt Sally. Well, gosh, I think I would have to say to anybody, don't try that at home. Kelly, in his dictionary, gives the following. Sure dut and dogan, cre dut a dogan, dar a crush, dar a cron, dar a madja beg jirach as cam, ons a kele veg shed hall ma veresu and kyon jin dogan verums and kyon jids erahon, which literally means, here's the firebrand for you. What did the firebrand say? By the cross, by the mark, by the little straight stick, and a bend in the other little stick over yonder, if you will put the head of the firebrand off the firebrand, I'll put your head off for it. So there we go. What's described as a children's game, but I suggest that any children listening don't play that at home.
Gullas Gagan.
Brian Stowell, was involved in a bilingual programme, Tre de Lure, a phrase many people are familiar with, meaning time enough. It was originally a half-hour programme, but it soon became just a quarter of an hour because that fitted in a complimentary way, with another 15-minute programme that Fenella Bazin made called The Learning Curve, with news of research into Manx history and culture. Well, for Tre de Lure, Brian would often go to an event and he'd interview people by asking a question in Manx, repeat that question in English, and when they replied, he'd sometimes give a short précis in Manx of what they'd said before asking another question in the same way. Mark Kermode was another contributor. I did quite a few. There were other occasional contributors, and I used to put the programme together from all that they gave me. And my own modus operandi was to choose a subject, perhaps explaining the background of something in the news, and I'd say a couple of sentences in Manx, then repeat those in English, and then I'd say a couple more sentences in English, and then repeat those in Manx, and carry on that way through the programme. So the subject matter there was the same in Manx and English. In fact, the sort of content covered by Tre de Lure and The Learning Curve were then put together in a half-hour programme called Seach Le, started in 2004, originally written and produced by Catherine Nichol, which looked at events during the week, the 7 days of the programme's title. Adrian Kane, David Fisher and Fiona McArdle were the presenters, and they were translating some parts of the script into Manx and reading out all the other parts as well. When Adrian and David weren't going to be available, Marilyn Crellin and myself became involved in their place, still with Fiona, and then I took over from Catherine, writing and producing the programme from March in 2012.
Hello, I'm Fiona McArdle, and I'd like to welcome you to Seach Le. Banachtan, sé Fiona McArdle mish, as bevariam goltacha siú gus Claire show, Seach Le.
Hello, I'm Marilyn Crellin, and I'd like to welcome you to Seach Le. Mish Marilyn Crellin, as bevaliam cyffail cherry udus a Claire show, Seach Le.
Hello and welcome to this programme, Seach Le. I'm Bob Carswell. Sé Robert de Carslach mish, as bevaliam siúis altacha gus an Claire show, Seach Le. There's also a couple of programmes which are BBC Manx Radio co-productions, just under an hour apiece, and I think arising at the time it was being arranged for the BBC to work out a broadcasting house. Now, for one of the co-productions, I recycled the name Tre de Lure, with the first one broadcast in October 2011. And in Manx, it follows the arc of news stories over the week's worth of Manx Radio news bulletins. Also includes sound bites, 30 seconds apiece perhaps, people talking to the Manx Radio news team in English. But I make a translation into Manx of each sound bite as well. Radio Siodiw tredalwr yn sio radio fanning AM 30 Shayad Hach. Clary was Gulligion the weather on BBC as Radio Vanning. Tredalwr is a BBC Manx Radio co-production. Actually, the original idea for Tredalwr was more of a Manx magazine programme and went out and did interviews with people, but really there weren't quite enough different things happening from week to week to cover in that way. And, of course, there's always a constant flow of politics and other news items that I can talk about and explain in Manx for Tredalwr. The other BBC Manx Radio co-production was James Jehania, which means James on Friday, just after 5 to 6 o'clock on a Friday afternoon. And that was first broadcast in October 2011 as well, originally presented by James O'Meara, probably aimed more at being a learning aid, I think, by James.
Moramais, kiss down.
Brow, Gurmayed.
Kiss down.
Sammy brow, Gurmayed, as a seedin.
Oh, brow.
Anshabi, Sammy goldest doolish nish.
Maidel yo, Himu.
Himu reached.
A crack and cry.
Explore the Manx language at learnmanx.com. Then James Harrison took it over, so it was fortunately able to stay as James Jehania, and James Harrison based it around quizzes with quite a lot of quirky and jokey material in it, so it could involve all sorts of things.
Faster as falt, dus James Jehania. Edder nish a sherech leg, claimad, quiz and chachten. Ta 3 an nega quiz, gorillachen, ta shen cat 3 question mechan, an ape, moor, and gorilla. Naechten, ruthen ta dachert and chachten shaw, as Ratchen fade, Ratchen laure ta right, harish faded laure, faded fade modus ugression. Fifai. Chenullion traun, Guramai moor house and clay, quiz a chachten, as fuddy the vacuum shoe and chachten shot chit. Slendu.
James Harrison was James Jehania. He also used to have studio guests, and one of them on a very regular basis was Daniel Quayle. Well, more recently, Daniel has taken over the programme, which concentrates now on playing new music, often Celtic music, but also from other traditions, and he talks about the music and the musicians, and what gigs are coming up, and so on, and that's all in Manx, of course. But with no James in the mix now, the name has been changed to Ceol as Cúis, music and chat.
Fast mai, ta siw geisiach rys Ceol as Cúis merams Daniel Quayle, chle fast diw ram Ceol fai ffain y crwnia. Ta siw fe geisiach rys Ceol as Cúis, Radio Vannin AM mish Daniel Quayle as manach rin siw clasin yn chled yn chle, foddi siw geisiach rys manxradio.com rys siachn. Bwys den BBC as bing imsgelia chilgach son cerdwn yn ergyd as de Radio Vannin son cyrna tonnen yisach dwn. Gaw siw cyrrael as him siw yn chachn chochit.
In a general way, the profile of the Manx language on Manx Radio was raised enormously in a very simple way when Brian Ray was the weatherman, and he used to say, Moramai. Well, Andy Wint was keen to take that up, and eventually that led to the use of Moramai and Fastamai at the start of news bulletins. And in the introduction to the news, you hear Shaw Radio Vanning. And it's just left there, no big deal made of it. It's just an ordinary part of the everyday output, which I think is just how it should be, and I think it's very effective in marking Manx Radio out from other stations. For some time, too, there's been a podcast made of Seach Le and Claire na Gael, plus a digest of the Manx content of those programmes and Gullas Gagan and Ceol as Cúis in a podcast called Aber Shen Rish. Say that again. don't usually include anything from Tre the Lure, because Tre the Lure is so news-based. When Manx Radio got The Sound of Your Life, Manx Radio, jingles done, Alana MacLean overdubbed the music with An Shean Tons the Ve, Radio Vanning, in August 2011.
Radio Vanning.
And since then there have been the nation station, Manx Radio, done as Stasiwn and Asiwn Radio Vanning. And it's been made to fit, even though there's a different scan pattern in Manx Radio and Radio Vanning.
Stasiwn and Asiwn Radio Vanning. Stasiwn and Asiwn Radio Vanning.
So, all in all, the Manx language and Manx Radio have come a long way since that first news bulletin read by Doug Fargher, Dúlis Caracha, on Sunday the 11th of October 1917.
The sin codjera naiach na seachtin son a seachtin show was Dúlis Caracha, banach yeru.
If your knowledge of the Manx language extends to take a listen with fresh ears.
Mother my kistow, Tammy bow disallow. Mother my kistow, Tammy bow disallow.
The living language of the people of man.